Is there any hope for U.S.-Chinese relations?
There's certainly hope that the U.S. and China will not go to war, but the two countries are very much established as rivals, not only because of very strange balloons, but also a whole variety of factors ranging from tensions over Taiwan and zones of influence in the South China Sea to industrial competition that leads to espionage of every conceivable kind, to the very fact that in addition to trade and currency pressures, the two countries have radically different forms of government and are in the midst of a Cold War between the liberal democracies of the West and despotic regimes in an informal alliance.
There were researchers that found this balloon in the sky. They made it public, and it became a public security nightmare for the administration. I think they probably would have rather keep things under kind of behind closed doors and in the shadows.
One very interesting thing to wonder is why the previous three cases during the Trump administration were not made public. I do not know if actually no one saw them. I don't know if they took any action to suppress the information, but it is rather odd and certainly in sort of contrast to the belligerence that the administration of Trump showed towards China for at least part of his tenure.
And it is curious as to why as you noted, Mr. Perry, that they didn't make it public. Now there's a competition between the Democrats and the Republicans who is tougher on China.
We don't know what was on that balloon. It's been shot down. We don't know what's been recovered, but it's quite possible that it was picking up a lot of very sensitive signals and geospatial intelligence.
Dan, do you think that the spying balloon was, in a sense, a Chinese trial balloon, as in to test the American response or lack thereof, and not actually, intelligence gathering, or not just?
I mean, it's hard to believe that balloons in this day and age are needed for intelligence gathering. I understand that there's some version of an explanation, but I cannot divine what was on their minds. I just think it's a little bit unfortunate that when the world, in fact, needs cooperation between these two countries and they need understanding between the U.S. and China, that something like this should happen, which does not further those goals, and in particular when China reacts to it with what appear to be transparent, brazen, and even preposterous lies, when it was very clear that the balloon was navigating, not lost off course, but navigating over sensitive sites in Montana and making its way across the entire country. Their highly mendacious response, I think, will serve to further demonize China in the eyes of the American public, and that's unfortunate.
I do think that this was kind of a clarifying moment for the United States here. I think there was a sense maybe that we cannot deny that this great power competition is heating up, and that perhaps we are facing an adversary right now that is far more brazen than anything that we may have expected previously. And so this may be that moment, a wake-up call, if you will, for Washington to get its priorities straight.
Dan, is anyone waking up?
It is more or less fair enough that the countries spy on each other. And as has been said, industrial and strategic espionage doesn't shock anyone. But the fact that it was done in this particular way does potentially serve as a wake-up call that China means business when it sees itself as in a Cold War rivalry with the U.S.
So, Carissa, can we define it as the start of a Cold War, or are we in the middle of it?
The term Cold War is a bit problematic because it's a totally different world. And the Cold War refers to a situation where the economies were not at all interlinked. And as was mentioned earlier, in the current situation, they're deeply intertwined. And one of the pressures that the U.S. faces is China's ability to gain access and control over a lot of key minerals and that are necessary for those semiconductors that I talked about earlier, and cobalt, and as was mentioned, rare earths. So,
but by the way, I have to say, another definition of Cold War is a hostility without a shooting war. And I think when you have that, plus you have interlinked economies, then things are very dangerous indeed.
Was the balloon the real reason, or merely the excuse for the cancellation of Blinken's visit?
The U.S. clearly wanted the visit, so the balloon is indeed the reason. The more interesting question is China. They had to have known it would likely be discovered and it would scuttle the plan. So if they wanted to, fine. If not, it does raise concerns about decision-making in Beijing. And one might suspect that the various branches are even not coordinated, and the whole thing is a mess, which is, of course, something that would neutralize one of the main advantages of dealing with a dictatorship, that at least you know more or less what to expect.
Is Washington's China policy working, Dan?
Look, the U.S. has a huge trade deficit with China. I don't think it's very happy about that. The U.S. feels vulnerable because China holds $1 trillion in U.S. debt, and they're not too happy about that. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to Taiwan. All this stuff, I think, is a little bit in the background, and issues that are strategic around the South China Sea, but in particular Taiwan, are probably the main thing. The only thing that truly can blow up this standoff between the U.S. and China is that, and that depends really on Xi. His past bellicosity, as Clarice said, seems to have subsided somewhat, probably because they are experiencing economic difficulty.
Jonathan, is the White House taking the right approach? Is Biden too soft on the Chinese, as GOP leaders argue?
I'm not sure we have a China policy yet, if I'm going to be really honest. I think that, 20, 30 years ago, I think our approach was to go all in, buying cheap Chinese products and getting cheap Chinese labor, collaborating as much as possible, and offering the opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party to engage more with the West and to become responsible global stakeholders. That has clearly failed. Now we're in the process of wagging our finger at a whole bunch of other allies, telling them not to engage as we did for the last several decades, asking them to curb their engagement with the Chinese while we still have massive amounts of business. Just about every product you can buy on Amazon is made in China. As we just heard, they're holding massive amounts of American debt. We've got a lot of work to do ourselves if the goal is to decouple, as it's often said.
Another issue is the dashing of U.S. hopes that China can become a player that, although it has very much a different system that the U.S. does not agree with, can be an ally in geostrategic issues. And we see very clearly what I called before an informal alliance of despotisms as regards Russia today, as regards Iran, for the past decade or more, really. There's almost no way to rope in China into anything resembling a global consensus that the U.S. will find reasonable, and that's a major problem.
At the same time, Xi Jinping has said he wants to reshape global governance to make the world more conducive to China's interests.
Well,
and I think it's definitely incumbent upon democracies and like-minded countries to work together, in spite of the fact that, yes, the United States holds different standards for itself as it does for others. Nonetheless, I think it's in everyone's interest to cooperate.
The post-war order was really created by the West, led by the U.S. It cannot be denied that when the U.S. hoped to rope China into that world order, it was a world order of its own making, and to a degree, very convenient to the West. Indeed, China wants something completely different, and the implications societally, culturally, economically, geopolitically are enormous, and that's a challenge for the U.S. and the West.
I don't think it's so clear how things are developing. There's movement by both the U.S. and China, and it's definitely an ongoing competition.
I would also note that we can do a disservice by pretending that we're talking about two equal players on the world stage. Nonetheless, China has shown spectacular economic growth. There's no discussion about that. But at the same time, where that growth brought it to is this: with about 1/6 of the world's population, it accounts for about 1/6 of the world's economy. The U.S., with less than 5% of the world's population, I think still accounts for 1/3 of the world economy. So China's catching up, but in nominal terms, it has a very, very long way to go.